I must have passed out at some moment, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a horrible panic. Sweat coated me and adrenaline coursed through me from the moment I opened my eyes. Had my leg not been injured, I would have been standing in less than a second, but instead I found myself with my back against the kitchen cabinet, eyes darting wildly through the room. It could have been seconds or hours. There was no way of knowing, since I hadn't put batteries in the clock yet. The only indications that time had passed was that thing had stopped crying, and my phone was at 1%. My charger was by the computer. Somehow, the fact that I had a mission made me feel a little better. What was I otherwise to do? Sit and wait until my buttered chicken supply is depleted? Or until the power stops working? Where was the power even coming from? Somehow, in some strange way, my house was still connected to Arizona. The plumbing also seemed to work just fine. So this gave me 3 tasks for the day. 1. Get my charger. 2. Ensure light on the upper levels of my house. 3. Investigate outside. Sliding off the kitchen counter revealed an immense pain where the beast had bludgeoned me. I had no first aid knowledge, so I simply let my leg fester as it did. Whatever home remedies I could imagine would probably make the situation worse. First aid was not a strong suit of mine, but DIY tinkering was. I filled a bag with tools, flat pieces of wood, and some more nails. Using the saber as a walking stick, I limped and dragged my leg out of the kitchen. Immediately when passing the bottom of the stairs, my senses spiked in the direction of the upstairs walkway. Although it was well lit, my instincts set off warning bells. My eyes swept slowly and examined every minute detail, when I noticed the bathroom door was slightly open. A shudder ran down my spine, and my heart began pumping as the door slowly creaked shut. That thing was watching me. Anxiety seemed to work as a sort of radar, and my fear could be directed at spots where the beast lay in waiting. Perhaps she was hiding from fear, or perhaps she lay in ambush. Slowly, I began ascending the steps, during which I called out, "I'm coming up! Don't do anything stupid!" as I whooshed my saber on. By the time I had reached the top, I was shaking like a shrub in a storm. I divided my attention between standing guard and inspecting the light switch I had secured the night prior. It seemed she had attempted to claw at it without proper understanding, like an animal that knew a container contained food, but wasn't certain how to open it. I had a cat growing up, named Skipper, who would knock sacks of wet food on the ground and puncture them with his teeth, but never extracted more than juices. This scene reminded me of that. Like the shadow beast had all the strength to remove the nails and scratch off the glue, but instead resorted to frustrating slashes. 5 rooms on this floor. To my left was the future location of my home gym, then my bedroom, then the bathroom, then a closet, and finally, on the far right, my office. Last I had seen of the shadow beast, she had closed the bathroom door from within. I took a single, cautious step in the direction of my office. No reaction from the beast. I took another step, then 3, and so on, until I stood before my dark office with little glowing stars on the ceiling and walls. The door had been absolutely demolished, and only a fragment remained on the hinges. I could hardly believe that slender figure had managed such devastating damage. Looking down at my leg, I suddenly realized how close I was to dying in that moment, and even now. The light switch was around a corner, which would require 2 steps in, then a turn into the dark. I stood there silently, ears burning with anticipation, and eyes wider than the sky in a flat field. I heard nothing and saw nothing, but I felt a deep dread at the thought of entering even 2 steps into the unknown. Much like the first night of my arrival to this house, I stood petrified by my office. I would have loved to say that I was in contemplation of my next move, but that would be a lie. My mind was utterly empty other than the pressure of my racing heart. With my saber forward, casting a red glow into the abyss, I finally made my step. From what I had seen, the shadow was faster than a human, and if I were to make a race for the light switch, she would beat me. So, I would have to beat her with methodical and calculated choices. If I can't win at her game, I can force her to play mine. I tossed a hammer into the room, and immediately the shadow threw itself against the metal and crushed into the wall. That brief moment she was distracted. I jumped in and turned the lights on. She shrieked like a banshee and lashed out at me with one of her long arms. She missed and instead knocked plaster out of the wall. Dust and debris peppered me as I swung my sabre against her, hitting the back of her head. This time, I heard a desperate cry for mercy from her. "No!" she pleaded, while dashing off into the hallway and throwing herself into the closet. Then, I heard her wailing in sorrow, not the weeping of yesterday. This was the wailing of a parent that had just lost her child, or of someone who was in agony. It echoed from all corners of the house, anywhere where there was darkness. I heard her crying. She was in every room with a shadow. Fearful or not, I had a mission. My hands were shaking and dripping sweat as I secured the office light switch. That was one more room I had conquered back from the devil. Since my water and electricity were still running smoothly, a thought popped into my head. I immediately limped over to my computer and started her up. My phone may not have had any data connection, but maybe my PC would. It ran on an Ethernet cable after all. However, my house was off the grid, and I had installed an antenna on the roof to get connection. Regardless, I had nothing to lose. After a quick boot up, I confirmed that I had no internet. I plopped down into my chair and waited as my phone began charging. At this point, my $600 Android was nothing more than a glorified flashlight, but it might save my life. That demon kept crying, wailing a haunted sorrow that emanated from all angles. It reminded me that she was more gas or liquid than a solid matter, yet, somehow, she displayed behaviours I recognised as human. She was frightened of me, for some reason, and spoke English. Maybe she hadn't said no, and instead just let out a little yelp that my mind interpreted as a word. So far, she hadn't responded to anything I'd said, but I also hadn't asked a question yet. My stomach churned violently as I heard the gases in me rumble, and a stinging pain bubbled up. My gut told me not to converse with the beast, although I knew not why. So far, my instincts had kept me alive, so I pushed away any thought of communicating with the demon. Suddenly, I felt a small bout of relief as I solidified within myself that she was an enemy. I didn't know what she was or what she wanted. I didn't know if she was inherently evil, or more like an animal operating on script like a rabid dog. By the sounds of her cries, a part of me wondered if she was worth a shred of mercy, if she was perhaps in pain and in need of a saviour. That shred now died and was replaced with my own merciless lust for survival. I cared not for any kind of coexistence. I cared not to see her as more than a beast. That is nature, is it not? Perhaps she was the exact opposite of human, an unholy mirror of man. She feared light and slept in the day, a nocturnal predator in the crevices of man's lodging and safe haven, a parasite to humanity itself, and I don't tolerate parasites. Suddenly, the fear and anxiety in me, that which plagued me the moment I set foot in this accursed house, turned to something different. No longer did I feel repelled by the beast. Like two magnets that were forced by nature to avoid one another, something in me flipped so violently that I now felt compelled to hunt her down. I didn't know what she was. I didn't need to know what she was, and I didn't care what she was. I would reduce her to dust, rip her to the very essence of her chemistry. My phone was 40% charged, so I pocketed the charger and installed a strobe-like effect, then began my hunt. She was an nocturnal beast in this parallel universe with no sun, but she wasn't the apex predator, for I too was nocturnal. "Shut up, bitch!" I shouted while kicking the bathroom door open. It swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Her crying stopped, and a gasp sounded through the entire house. I found an incarnation of her on the other end, covering her face and hiding in the bathtub. I didn't bother to turn the light on. I was too focused on beating her with my weapon. Under the strobe light, Our altercation became jerky and clay-motion-esque. She seemed confused and frightened at the repeated assault on a cover of darkness. It was a barrage for her, similar to how we might experience a subtle electrical shock over and over again, discombobulating and preventing us from forming any meaningful response to the attack. Every strike I landed left her obsidian skin sizzling like steak charred on the grill for hours too long. It smelled of burning fat and blubber. One of her long arms covered her face, while the other flailed wildly against me and soaked up the bulk of my attacks. "No!" she shouted, before slapping me on the side of my head and sending me spinning out of the bathroom door. My face was fine, but I felt a pulpy warmth where my ear was, and profound ringing. Despite my daze, I managed to keep hold of my saber, as I considered it my lifeline. She screamed like a teenager having a tantrum, half anger, half agony, half fear. 150% fucking psycho. The bathroom was now pitch black, and my flashlight couldn't penetrate the liquid beyond the door. Through the shroud, her petite fingers emerged and wrapped around the doorframe. Her little nails dug into the wood and ripped off a chunk of either side as she suddenly dashed out from the dark and lunged at me. It was in this moment that I saw her face for the first time. She was no woman I'd ever seen. She had an elongated mouth, like something between human and dog. Her eyes were nothing but pale grey dots, half hidden beneath long hair. There was a profound misery in her, intensified by a hunched stance and figure so slender I could see the joints in her bones move. Her beastly mouth opened to receive my neck, but in that split second, I managed to position the saber just right. I thrust my blade into her mouth and jammed it with force down her windpipe. She half-heatedly finished her interrupted strike by slapping her petite fingers against me. It should have been impossible, but those tiny nails ripped into my shirt like claws, and when she rolled off of me, she pulled with her half of my shirt. I now had 3 wounds from her, and I was covered in blood. She may have been vulnerable to light, but her strength was undeniable. Yet, here she lay, spastically flailing her long limbs like out-of-control fire hoses as her skin sizzled away. Half the saber's blade was shoved down her neck, and she was trying to pull it out, but every time her fingers touched the blade, her fingers began to burn. Finally, she grabbed the hilt and managed to pull the saber out. She then flung it with a hatred back into the office. I was now without weapon, and she was still alive. A black and murky liquid poured out of her mouth, along with bouts of smoke. The darkness of the bathroom suddenly began leaking out, reaching for her, enveloping her with a coating. I knew not what this mystical beast was, but something told me it was about to regenerate. The dark wrapped around her ankle and pulled her with a sudden jolt back into the depth of the bathroom before slamming the door shut. From here, I could see that the saber had broken beyond repair, so I stumbled down the stairs. My phone had shattered from the fall and didn't respond, so I began collecting my makeshift bonfires. Something told me that this was only the beginning of our fight. I prepared my stash so that I could light a dozen bonfires with the flick of a Bic lighter, then turned my attention to first aid. I downed another handful of painkillers, along with some whiskey, then used the shirt and the rest of my whiskey to make a Molotov cocktail, which I set on the counter alongside the bonfires. If I die, it will be in flames and fire, not in the shadows. The left side of my chest was covered in blood, so I stuffed paper towels into my wound and used an entire roll of duct tape to compress it. Did the same with my ear. I already said I wasn't a good medic. Blood loss had made me dizzy, so I unpacked my espresso machine, which had still been in a moving box, and filled a cup with 6 espresso pods. For good measure, I used another roll of tape to further compress my wounds. This did reduce the amount that my lungs could expand, but I was hoping coffee would make up for my lack of oxygen. Then, without eating it up or even grabbing a fork, I shoveled some buttered chicken and rice into my mouth for good measure. So there I stood, smeared in curry and blood, shirtless and wrapped in duct tape, operating on coffee, buttered chicken, and whiskey. Never in my life had I felt so fucking ready for war. When all the lights in my house turned off simultaneously, I wasn't even shocked. Somehow, I had anticipated this. Autopilot took over, and I began lighting my pots and pans bonfires. My anxiety used to drive me to madness. Every tiny noise in a silent room became amplified by panic attacks. But now, in the wake of war, it meant a useful radar. I heard the beast in my house. I knew where she was. She no longer tried to conceal herself. She was in the garage, by the fuse box. That's how she plunged my home into the abyss. And now she came storming towards me like a cavalry charge, eager to reconquer her domain of darkness. But I stood ready. When she revealed herself by the kitchen doorframe, she halted. And I swear, I saw fear in those pale grey specks of eyes. I stood with a flaming pan in each outstretched arm, glowing orange and defiant of her domain. She was a threat to me as much as I was a threat to her. "I'm going to burn this house down with you inside of it," I stated bluntly. "No! Don't you ever say anything else!" I shouted back. The only response she gave me was dropping down onto all fours and charging towards me like a rabid animal. I held both pans in front of me like shields of light, shields she easily sidestepped. She was much faster than me, and I was again struck in the side of my head, the same as the previous one. I wasn't certain how much more damage I could take. Flames rained all around us as fabric and splinters exploded through the air. One of the pots I simply turned upside down and held against the top of her head, blinding her as I slipped away before she could strike me again. I then grabbed another pot and dumped it on her bark before making an escape to the dining room, where I lit the Molotov cocktail. I saw her in the kitchen screaming and fighting the flames. Instead of chucking the Molotov at her, I threw it at the base of the curtains. The fabric immediately caught flame and filled the entire dining room with an eruption of orange. The beast then charged towards me from the kitchen, wailing and moaning a putrid hunger. I darted out the far dining room exit and looped around to the back of the kitchen. She was more animal than human after all, and I felt confident that I could outsmart her. The flames were not doing as well as I had hoped they would. I grabbed a glass bottle of expensive olive oil and threw it as hard as I could onto the floor. In an instant, a cloud of oil erupted and engulfed me in flame. I thought for sure I had just committed accidental suicide, but the cloud left existence as soon as it came. It did little other than just make the floor slippery and sharp with glass. It was worth a try, but produced nothing of value. The beast came charging after me. I threw 2 flaming pots in her direction, forcing her to cover her face and eyes, while I grabbed the last bonfire, a saucepan, and made way for the kitchen exit. The beast slipped on the oil-covered ground and fell into the shards of glass and burning remnants of my first 2 bonfires. Her wails echoed through the entire house, humming from all directions. This final bonfire acted as a torch in the dark caverns of my home as I barreled towards the garage. The darkness enveloped me, and it seemed it tried to snuff the bonfire, but failed. Instead, it could only reduce my field of vision to near null. The beast could be heard behind me, somewhere in the pitch black, but I didn't turn to look. The sound of her struggle indicated that the oil had reduced her speed, giving me an edge. I opened the garage door and hit the light switch, knowing it wouldn't turn on until I reached the fuse box. When I did reach the fuse box, I saw, under the flickering lights, that she had ripped out every single wire. There was literally no repairing it. She was also only 4 steps away. I jumped into the drive seat of my Mustang, locked the door behind me, and turned on the high beams. The demon was caught in the middle and let out a shriek. The shadows of the garage retreated back into the corners slower than before, a retreat nonetheless. The demon shrank and jumped out of the lights, then bolted out the garage. The high beams were too much for even me, but they meant life. A knee-high smoke crawled into the garage from the dining room, but I wasn't nearly done. I crawled under my car with a bucket. It was at this moment I felt most vulnerable, but my anxiety wasn't going haywire, indicating to me that I was safe. At this point, I could rely on my instinct. I began draining my fuel tank and rummaging through the moving boxes in the garage. Along with some rags and turpentine, I now lugged with me a sloshing bucket of gasoline. Any misstep would now mean a very uncomfortable death, but it was for me, or her, or both of us, and I would rather see us both die than just me. With my saucepan forward, I stepped back into the hallway. To my left, my dining room glowed in epic orange. I ran towards the dining room and held the bucket into the fire, erupting that room with a magnificent pressure and heat. Fire spewed out in all directions, and I was knocked back. Noxious gas and thick air surrounded me. My saucepan had slipped from my grip, and I was left to crawl towards the back door on all fours like an animal, like the beast. From all angles and every room, I heard the cries and agony. The walls were vibrating, the black liquid seeped from every corner, pooling at my feet like an icy sludge. Something I had felt while hiking glacial peaks was somehow in my house. But I knew I was winning. I could feel it in the pain and suffering of the witch as she cried. I just had to make it to the back door, and I could watch my house go up in flame. Even if I never return to Arizona, and I am trapped in this strange plane of existence for the rest of my life, let it be so. I'll die here and drag her down with me. Just as I grabbed the door handle, the witch materialized from the corner of the room, where the thick sludge streamed down like a frozen waterfall. I slipped outside and slammed the door shut, feeling the vibration of her slam against it. Something told me that I was safe outside, whatever that meant. This was my first time setting foot into this strange and alien world of flat grass. The demon moaned in agony and pain, then wept and cried. I looped around the house and collapsed onto the front lawn. The fire had spread all through the bottom floor, escaping through the windows, where it then caught flame to the exterior of the second floor. The crackling was only eclipsed by the witch's moan. I sat there, watching my house go up in flame, along with everything else I owned. I had bought that house outright with my life savings. Somehow, there was no overwhelming despair within me, just a peaceful indifference. After a few hours, the middle collapsed inward, sagging the upper floor down to the ground in a cacophony of creaking wood and hissing flame. All I could think was, try to find a shadow there, monster. Somewhere in that pile of smouldering flame, the witch had been slain. I had been awake, more or less, for 3 days straight, and now lay in the cool grass. The last memory I had of that night was staring up at the Goliath of a moon. Peace enveloped me, and my mind shut down.